So if you are a Game of Thrones fan, everyone out there, except for me, you might still be recovering from last night's epic battle at Winterfell. My Facebook feed, bonkers.
That's all it was, right?
People lost their mind. I guess something happened at the end or something. Anyways, today we're taking a closer look at that battle and how advanced technology could have actually shaped some of the outcomes.
So now, as a warning, we're about to talk a little bit about this season's third episode. So please, if you haven't seen it, we advise you to step away from your screen, from your phone, from your Roku, from whatever device you're watching us on, because there might be some very small spoilers ahead. So again, there might be some very small spoilers ahead. Please don't yell at me on Twitter. I'm not the executive producer of this broadcast. So Dan Patterson is a senior reporter at CNET, and he joins us to talk about some of the technology or lack thereof in Game of Thrones. Good to see you.
Hey, you as well.
So let's talk about the technology and the lack thereof, and what could have made a difference in Game of Thrones' biggest battles. Maybe we don't even have to talk about the battle of last night, the long night. Let's talk about some of the other battles.
Yeah, so with all due respect to spoilers, we'll try to keep this, and to our staff who did produce this, and some of whom have not had a chance to watch this.
Okay.
So we know that there was a big battle last night, but there were lots of battles, and this is one of the few times you will hear me say this, Anne-Marie and Vlad, but my kingdom, or my 7 kingdoms, for some ballistic missiles, and maybe one of these micro supercomputers we keep in our pockets that we call iPhones. Now, look, there are some technologies that kind of weave their way throughout Game of Thrones. We saw this thing called wildfire used in previous seasons, but they said the time and energy to create this ballistic technology was such that it just wasn't on hand, which means that we see these battles that have no communication and no aerial or ranged weapons. So everything has to happen hand by hand. So some of the technologies that have sadly driven human history forward are those that have helped military advances, and ballistic weapons, starting with gunpowder, powder, as well as the ability to communicate at distance using encryption, so being able to scramble messages a little better than a little stamp on the back of a Raven envelope, are 2 technologies that really have helped human history evolve, and we haven't seen those at all in Game of Thrones.
But Game of Thrones takes place over like the span of thousands of years. Why are they still using the same technology?
Why are they using trebuchets? That's
right.
I mean, like, that's hundreds of years old here.
So in researching this segment, we kind of asked some of the biggest questions of Game of Thrones and this lack of technological advancement in a society that looks kind of like a Bronze Age human society. Now, why? Okay, we see this existential weapon that we call dragons. We also see another existential weapon called the Night King. And depending on your point of view, the showrunners have said kind of laissez-faire, hands off. These are existential threats, or at least analogs towards many of the existential threats we see today. And often when you have an existential challenge and a weapon, you put more energy into preserving that weapon than you do in other advancements. It's kind of zero sum. So economic advancements and trade require the same resources that you might spend on, say, feeding a dragon. Some of the other challenges that we see are this shifting between winter and summer happening instead of over a 12-month period. They happen over years and years and years, which could prevent the development of technologies like, say, fire. If it's always summer, or summer for a very long period of time, fire just kind of remains this tool that you use for cooking instead of something that develops, say, steam engines that could literally propel your society forward. We also see this locking up of knowledge. The cultures in Game of Thrones do value knowledge, except the maesters keep it in their tower. They don't allow it. Knowledge to be communicated by way of something that we had here, which is the printing press. The power of that one technology propelled human society forward in ways that we simply didn't see in Game of Thrones.
It is fascinating that they're still using ravens to send messages, when you would think with all the the magic that exists in the world of Game of Thrones, that they would probably have figured out a way to communicate, more efficiently over the course of the 1,000 years that this civilization has existed. So you talked about some of the technology that they do have. Is it because, and let's take a step back from this, which is that part of the allure of Game of Thrones is this idea that we are witnessing what appears to be a Bronze Age world, but that has the realities of it skewed. In other words, magic is very powerful. And when I read the books, I always felt like this. It felt like what we're seeing in Game of Thrones is the way people actually believe the world was. During the Bronze Age, people did believe in magic, and people did believe in sorcery and witches, and perhaps even mythical creatures. And so, what if those things actually existed, is sort of the way I imagine George R.R. Martin came up with this world.
Vlad, that is one of my favorite questions when it comes to not just the TV series Game of Thrones, but A Song of Ice and Fire that this show is based on. And look, I'll do a poor job of phrasing the great Arthur C. Clarke here. And he said that, look, all technology is just magic until we can figure out and explain the science. And this is maybe one of the greatest lessons of Game of Thrones. We are living in a society that does have facts. We have science. We have technology. And if we stick to the facts, to the science, to the technology, maybe we can avoid our own existential battles with great beings like the Night King or climate change.
I love, at least, in some films, for example, in the Avengers, Spider-Man points out that Captain America's shield does not follow the laws of physics. When films and movies take into account there's a tongue-in-cheek nature to what they're doing, that's kind of cool too. But this was a very geeky and nerdy discussion, and you were into it.
I like this conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And if you're looking for a recap of last night's episode, or to learn more about the technology side of Game of Thrones, you can search Game of Thrones on CNET.com.